So let's start here. Just, for my audience, can you explain what the grandmother hypothesis is so we can get everybody up to speed on that?
My temptation is to say that the usual textbook story of us is the hunting paternal provisioning hypothesis. That what happened with these climate swings that actually started in the Miocene and these very dry periods and then these swings in ancient Africa were breaking up the forest. And that had effects on the plants that were doing well and the animals that were doing well. So there was all kinds of response to this, and a population that's ancestral both to us and to genus Pan. So that's chimpanzees and bonobos. Some of those guys who then became our ancestors were drawn into the resources outside the forest. Now, in the forest, where chimpanzees still live today, and same way with gorillas, same way with orangutans, all the great apes, the babies can already feed themselves while they're nursing. Mom is carrying them along. She's feeding herself. They are starting to feed themselves within their first year. And we now have quantitative data showing the number of foraging bouts of these chimpanzee infants by the time they reach their first birthday is essentially the same that they'll continue until they're weaned. And then mom will have another baby and they're entirely independent feeders. But the population that was drawn to these other resources, there were payoff foods that gave you a really high return if you were big enough, but the little couldn't do it. And that is what set up. I mean, there could have been a lot of extinctions around.
Interesting.
But you are mom, and here is the infant. Then if it can't feed itself, then that is a problem for you. It will mean, oh, whoa, I can't have another one yet because I need to subsidize this one. But because the subsidies are not milk, it can be somebody else. And the older females whose fertility was ending, they're still big. Their return rates are high. And we actually have data from these wonderful old Hadza grandmothers who are old ladies, and their return rates are the same. Still, they are big enough and strong enough with these foods. And that means that their productivity, their economic productivity, can subsidize the fertility of the childbearing ages still. And so that means these two things then get favored by selection. Increased longevity, post-menopausal longevity, and shorter birth intervals. And those two things co-evolve down the generations. And because we hung our grandmother hypothesis on these models trying to explain the broad variation in mammal life histories, you think mouse to elephant, whoa, there's so much variation. The ones that take a long time to grow up and are big, and then they live a long time and have babies at a slow rate, like elephants. And then the ones that, boy, they really go fast and they have as many babies as they can because they're going to die. Well, I was so influenced by a theoretical biologist who had built models to explain that variation. And actually, our life history seems so, wait a minute, if you look at the relationship between adult mortality and age at maturity, which would be first birth, when we're talking about, this ape, we're talking about people who
humans,
humans who are foraging for a living. So the mortality regime is different than the one we live under. No scientific medicine, no public health, and what is the case is that the relationship between adult mortality and age at maturity in us is right where it ought to be in that model. And that was puzzling because in the model, through adulthood, females are continuing to produce offspring. Well, wait a minute. How can we fit that model? And yet, childbearing ends in us. And now we have these data showing it's the same thing in chimpanzees. If they live long enough, before 50, fertility is over. They're going through menopause too. That is an ancestral condition, but they're aging way faster and they don't usually make it to those ages.
Right.
And
yes, right.
And what happened in us was there was a fitness payoff for aging more slowly, because by subsidizing those grandchildren, you ended up having way more descendants. And that's how natural selection works, right? And so seeing that this model, Eric Charnov's mammal model, that, wait a minute, we fit for that, it ought to mean, if we're right, then we would not fit for the other invariant, as he called it. We ought to way higher rates of baby production. And that's exactly the case when we have the demographic data to show it. And so there we were with an explanation, but it was only the females. And it was then by beginning to recognize and take on board, this is such an important part of the story. All of us, and this is true for sexual reproducers generally, all sexually reproducing things, including plants, if they're sexual reproducers, right? And including hermaphrodites. So there are all kinds of cool organisms that do things really differently, but are sexual reproducers. And if so, then everybody has one mother and one father, and they get half their genes from mom, half from dad, and every one of us and every individual in sexually reproducing taxa, it takes one haploid sex cell joining with another haploid sex cell to produce that cell, that zygote, that's the beginning of a new individual. So half of it comes from dad, half of it comes from mom. That's labeled in general in evolutionary biology the Fisher condition, that has all these consequences, because it means half the genes in future generations come through males, half come through females. And selection is working on everybody. And the various compromises that ensue from that are fascinating. And so and this was, well, it's hard for me not to tell the long story of how.
Right. No, you've been deep in the work. Let me just say one thing because I've listened to thousands of your podcasts. I've been studying your work. And what I just heard in what you just said is that we have been so closely compared to chimpanzees, and that where we start to see that we vary from chimpanzees is when we look at menopause. And part of how I even got to your work is I kept asking myself, what's the purpose of menopause? There's a reason we live 42% of our life post-reproductive.
Exactly.
And every person I asked that to, nobody could give me an answer until I found your work.
Absolutely.
And what I'm hearing and what you just said is chimpanzees, the young, are able to feed themselves very quickly.
Yes.
And post-reproductive, my understanding from your work is chimpanzees die within like 3 years or more after they're reproductive. But that doesn't happen to us because the grandmother is so important for the survival of the species that we had to go 42.5% of our life post-reproductive, because it was the grandmother that has kept our species alive, and that separates us from our chimpanzee friends. Is that right?
Lots of it is. I mean, somebody like me is going to say, survival of the species is not the way to try to think about things, because selection is all about competition within the species, right?
Okay.
Which ones do better, and that's what changes things over time. I mean, Darwin, it's amazing what he saw when he had so few tools, and astonishing.
That's cool.
I mentioned R.A. Fisher. So the combination of Mendelian inheritance and natural selection, it just gave us all these incredible tools to explain what's going on.
Yeah.
But what Jane Goodall did when she was really getting to know those chimpanzees at Gombe, she said, I put the beginning of old age at about 33, because what she saw was that the rate of aging was faster in these chimpanzees than it is in us. So it's not as though females live to the end of their fertility and then they die. No, they are dying at a higher rate. So it's actually very few of them who live through the end of their fertility, very few who live to and through menopause. But now we have these really cool data from this chimpanzee study site in Uganda, in Gogo, where a few females are still alive, and therefore the hormonal signature of menopause in these females looks just like this ape. So
like us. Wow.
We thought that was the case from the data that we could pull together. And now it's really been confirmed.
Now we're starting to see a little different.